you want to remember that the Russians did nothing with the first NATO expansion in 1999, and they did nothing with the second NATO expansion in 2004. So by 2014, we believed, for what we thought was good reason, that we could bring Ukraine and Georgia into the West. And we had no idea that this was going to blow up in our face. So we didn't anticipate it. Now, with regard to your second question, Claudia, which is whether or not Putin has imperial ambitions. Is Putin really interested in creating a greater Russia? First point is, there's no evidence he had any interest in that before February 22nd. The second point is, he does not have the capability to do that. The worst thing that Putin could do is to try to conquer Ukraine. As I wrote in the Foreign Affairs article, it would be like swallowing a porcupine. As all of you know, we live in the age of nationalism. And any time you invade a country, you invariably end up occupying it. And when you end up occupying that country, what invariably happens is you get tremendous resistance from the local population. You all remember what happened when you in the Soviet Union, invaded Afghanistan in 1979. It ended up as a disaster. You remember what happened when the Americans invaded Afghanistan? That disaster is about to be finished. Remember what happened when the Americans invaded Iraq? You remember what happened when the Americans went into Vietnam? The idea that Putin can reoccupy the Baltic states, reoccupy Ukraine, and other territories around the Soviet Union, and he could easily digest them, is not going to happen. And that's why he has shown no interest in trying to conquer Ukraine. What Putin is doing in Ukraine is very simple. He is trying to destroy Ukraine. And he is sending a message to the Ukrainians and to the West. And he is saying this: you have two choices here. One, you back off and you give up on making Ukraine part of the West. Or you continue to pursue that policy, in which case I will not let it happen, because I will destroy Ukraine as a functioning society. So what you're watching happen before your very eyes is you're watching the destruction of Ukraine. And this gets back to your question, Claudia, about arming Ukraine. If we arm Ukraine, it's going to make the situation worse, and it's going to speed up and intensify the destruction. So what the West is doing here is the West is leading Ukraine down the primrose path. We are encouraging the Ukrainians to pursue a policy that's guaranteed to end up with the destruction of their country. You want to remember what happened in August 2008 with the Georgians. We encouraged the Georgians to think that they could become part of the West. And the Georgian president acted accordingly. And he thought that he could taunt the Russians. Well, he was wrong. And you know what happened? In the crunch, when the trouble came, the West did nothing to help him, because Georgia is not a vital strategic interest for the United States. And the West, as I said to you, is not going to fight for Ukraine. We may arm Ukraine, but that will be disastrous for the Ukrainian people. With regard to this woman's question about Afghanistan, or her point about Afghanistan, I wasn't saying that the United States had no responsibility for what happened in Afghanistan. I wasn't talking about responsibility. I was just talking about what the consequences were for the Soviet Union when they invaded Afghanistan. And my point is that any time a great power invades a country like Afghanistan, or Ukraine or Vietnam or Iraq, you get into a lot of trouble. The second question was asking me if there are any parallels between Afghanistan and Ukraine. And I don't think that the parallels are very strong. The funny thing is, I think that in Afghanistan, the United States was trying to undermine the Soviet Union. I do think we had our gun sights, the United States had its gun sights on the Soviet Union in Afghanistan from the start. And the woman who asked the question brought up Zbigniew Brzezinski's name, and I think he fits perfectly with that story. But I actually don't think, and this gets to one of the later questions about us encircling Russia, I actually don't think that we thought that Putin was a threat. That was the point I made to you before. You should go back and see if you can find evidence of the Americans or the West Europeans, to include the Germans, talking about Putin as a threat and therefore needing to encircle Russia. The country that we are in the process of encircling, it's called containment, is China. That's the country we care about because we see China on the rise and we see Russia on the decline. So in a very important way, well, why, I can't, the problem is if I start answering all these questions, I mean, I have an answer to that, but I get to that later. You could ask. But Talleyrand, the French diplomat, had a saying. He said about a particular French policy, it's worse than a crime, it's a blunder. And that is what I think would describe Washington's policy. It was a blunder of giant proportions. These people who are running American foreign policy and who are running the EU and who are running the NATO, did not see this coming, right? Now, somebody said that, isn't this an example of the old politics coming back? And I think the answer is yes. And I think what happened here, and this answers the gentleman's question about why NATO expansion, is that the West and the Russians were playing according to two different playbooks. The Russians were operating as if geopolitics or realpolitik still mattered. Putin is a realist par excellence. He was saying that we have a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, and you have to respect that. The West, to answer your question, was not thinking in geopolitical terms. We were thinking in what I would call liberal or idealistic terms. It's the way people in the EU, it's the way people in Western Europe talk. They're talking about spreading democracy. They were talking about the Ukrainian right to choose its own foreign policy. They were talking about spreading capitalism, spreading institutions. Yes, but they did not see NATO as a means of containing Russia. That's my point to you. And if you show me the evidence they did, I'll buy it. Now, somebody raised the question about, is the United States interested in bringing Biden to Moscow? In other words, are we interested in toppling Putin from power? I think that if we can do it, we'll do it. We'd like to get rid of him. And Carl Gershman, who is the head of the Endowment for Democracy in the United States, which is basically the government's right arm for promoting democracy, wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post in September 2013, basically warning Putin that he might be next. So there's no question, given our fascination with regime change, that we would like to raise the costs for Putin, make the Russian people very angry with Putin, and hopefully topple him from power. But as I said to you before, you want to remember that if you do that, you're playing with fire. Two more. On the Crimea, right, if Crimea goes back to Ukraine, the question was, is that going to change how we think about Ukraine? The answer is no. First of all, Ukraine's not going back to, Crimea is not going back to Ukraine. And secondly, even if it did go back to Ukraine, Ukraine is not of vital strategic interest to the United States or to Western Europe. It is very important that you understand that, because that distinction between Russia's position on Ukraine and our position in the West on Ukraine, is fundamentally different. This is an existential threat to them. And when you're dealing with existential threats, you do not want to underestimate the costs that a state will be willing to absorb to prevail in a crisis. And again, if Putin gets desperate, remember he has nuclear weapons. But for us, it's not, with or without Crimea, a vital strategic interest. Final point, somebody noted that the U.S. and the Europeans sometimes have different interests or different views on Ukraine. I think this is absolutely correct. And I would note to you that in the April 2008 Bucharest summit, at the April 2008 Bucharest summit, which I talked about before, Angela Merkel, much to her credit, played a key role in preventing NATO from moving forward at that point to absorb Ukraine into NATO. It was the Americans, and indeed it was Victoria Nuland, who was then the U.S. ambassador to NATO, who was pushing hard for moving Ukraine into NATO. And the Germans, much to their credit, stopped that movement in its tracks. But where the Germans failed is that a communique was issued after the meeting that said Georgia and Ukraine would become part of NATO. And that's what led to all the trouble. But the Germans differed from the Americans. My only regret is that Angela Merkel has not distanced herself from President Obama and adopted a much more independent policy towards Russia, and tried to solve this one by abandoning NATO expansion and EU expansion.